My name is Amanda Wilkins, and I am the garden curator here at Juniper Level Botanic Garden. And today we're talking about survival in the garden, focusing on plants that you can use in case the apocalypse happens. I say that with a joke, in that there are humans have been using plants for a very long time to build civilizations, to just come out of the hunter-gatherer phase, and there are still civilizations that are in the hunter-gatherer phase and make it through, and it's all based on plants. Here at Juniper Level Botanic Garden, we have more than 28,000 different plants, lots of things to choose from, and of course our purpose in gathering the collection is for ornamentals, and just to see what will be hardy here in Raleigh, North Carolina. But there are lots of botanical gardens around the world that do gather culturally interesting or relevant plants. I've worked at the National Tropical Botanical Garden in Hawaii, and they have whole garden sections focused on canoe plants that the native Hawaiians brought, and still the native Hawaiians that live there today still utilize those plants as part of their pharmacy and their pantry, so to speak. But in the garden here, I'm just going to focus on a few topics, because what is surviving, right? What are the most important things about survival? Food, water, and shelter. So we're going to focus on some plants that can kind of meet one or all of those needs. And of course, like everybody, people usually ask me, especially young people, are always like, can I eat this? Is this edible? Or how do I use this? And that's a great question to always be thinking about plants. As a horticulturist, of course, we're always like, is it pretty? Will it grow here? Will it do good in my garden? But from a survival standpoint, it's always nice to be able to kind of remember those other things that you can use plants for, besides, warming your heart and filling your soul. And like I said, humans have been using plants for a very long time, and we can learn a lot of things from a lot of different peoples around the world about how to utilize plants. So the first plant I'm going to talk about, of course, is palms. This is Sable minor from Bear Creek. And sables are a big group here in southeastern United States, Central America, and they are palmate palms. They have this very wide open formation, and they do this really interesting thing here where they actually have a point where they hold all of the leaves out from, or the leaflets out from, and it's important this would be great for thatching on a roof. A lot of Native American tribes have used this for thatching. But the directionality of how you lay the palm leaf on the roofing is important. If you laid it with this side facing up, it would gather the water and pour it right back into your house. Flip it over and it will slough all the water away. Whenever I was in Hawaii, we built a traditional Hawaiian house, a hale, and we used Chinese fan palm fronds. And the gentleman who taught us, he was very specific and showed us all of the different pieces and how we had to thatch them together. And he was very adamant about making sure they were turned the right way, because otherwise you'd have a leaky roof. This is a really interesting plant. Most people think, oh, this is a grass, right? Well, this is actually a phormium, and it's a selection. It has a called Lineatum. It's got a variegated striping in it. It's a little winter worn, but that's okay. It'll reflush and look gorgeous. This plant is native to Australia and New Zealand, and the Maori there actually use this plant as protection from bullets, and thatching for clothing. It's very warm and very sturdy and tough. It is almost bulletproof, as well as just being hatchet proof. There was a lot of wars that happened there between the tribes, and you can weave this together, and it's very strong. If we have tried to cut this back in the garden, and you don't really want to cut it back every year. We do kind of tidy it up, but it will dull a pair of pruners faster than anything, and it's because of all of the chemicals and the silica in the leaves that protect it and make it a good thatching material. So thinking about plants and kind of the, what they're made out of and the chemistry within them, that can really inform how they can be used for survival, and whether it's eating or making food or harvesting water, or and then there are some things that are, not so good. Here in the garden, we have a very large collection of Helleborus, which we really love to grow, and they're gorgeous, and they're from the Mediterranean and from Europe, but they are super poisonous. We always recommend these for people who have problems with deer and rabbits in their garden, because they may get nibbled, but they will not get eaten to nubs unless they're really, really hungry. But if humans were to eat this would make you very, very, very sick. These are in the ranunculus family, the Ranunculaceae, and there's a lot of things in that whole family that are quite poisonous, or at least would make you very sick if you tried to eat them. Here at the garden, we like to know how things are related to each other. We really focus on the taxonomy. So if you're ever curious about what family they're in, most of the time we can tell you what that is. So knowing the names of things is good, with the caveat of an asterisk. So these are two plants here. These little heart-shaped leaf things are really lovely. These are two different species of Asarum. This is Asarum asarioides, bleached blonde, and Asarum subglobosum, Midori senju. And the common name for these is wild ginger. And whenever I say that to people are like, wait, that doesn't look like, the ginger I have in my garden, or that's not the ginger I saw when I was in Hawaii. And that's true, it's not. We call it wild ginger because if you crush the leaves, any of the tissues, they smell kind of peppery and gingery. And they're native to Eastern North America and to Asia. And in both of those places, they are used medicinally, but in a very, very small scale. We're talking like, maybe chewing on a couple of roots, like once a day, maybe for a very short wee while. If you were to actually ingest a lot of this, it would cause stomach issues. It has been related to, it has been said to be a carcinogen used at high levels. So dosage is important, and taking common names with a grain of salt is also important, because you think wild ginger, oh, I can put it in my tea, right? Maybe not so much. Bamboo. I would be remiss in talking about survival plants if I didn't mention bamboo. This one that I'm referring to right here, this is Alphonse Carr. It's a clumping bamboo. We only like to highlight clumping bamboos in the garden because, frankly, I don't have time to chase them around the garden, and neither does Tony or the gardeners. So we like to focus on those. But this is a great plant because it is fairly fast growing. And fast growing in air quotes for a bamboo, but it's not going to run everywhere. And this would be great for building things out of. Those are the perfect thickness for staking up vegetable plants, or weaving something sturdy out of them, building some very gentle scaffolding to prop something up. There are some textile bamboos here in Eastern North America, or Southeastern North America. We can grow the really, really big ones. And of course, those are great for gathering water, storing things. There's actually Kathy and Jim Phillips, who do the sculptures in the garden. They have all their studios in essentially a bamboo forest, and Jim uses the bamboo in his building his sculptures. Pedestals, but he will also make cups out of them, and actually has special tools just for working the bamboo into different useful storage devices, and it also slows the bamboo down a little bit. Fun common names. I saw this Epimedium earlier, And I was reminded of a professor that I had at NC State at the time, Dr. Will Hooker, who was the permaculture professor when I was at NC State a couple years ago. And you know, in permaculture, it's a good kind of a hot button word. That's going back to kind of ethnobotany and utilizing plants for multiple purposes and kind of putting those in your garden to help you do things. And he always joke about the horny goatweed. And at the time, you know, as a little budding horticulturist, it's like horny goatweed. And sure enough, so one of our major collections are Epimediums, which I love this one. It just says on the tag, it says Epimedium Asiatic hybrid. It's one that we got from Asiatica. But we have several of these in the garden, and we cut them back every year, so what they look like this time of year is just a flush of flowers. But they are, again, medicinal. You're not going to like take off a chunk of this and suddenly be cured of anything, but maybe chewing on a little bit is supposedly supposed to help with, you know, men's health in the bedroom, so to speak. I don't know if that's true or not, but it has been turned into pill form and promoted as a stimulant for men and their sex drive. Well, I'm not going to comment on that anymore, but it's a fun little aside. And palms come in different sizes, so they you know, if you're building a house or trying to thatch something or cover something up, this is Trachycarpus, Japanese fan palm, and this might not be so good for thatching your home. The palm fronds are very wide, and the leaflets don't overlap very much, but might be good for making a basket because it's a little easier to weave them together. But you know, thinking about how things are formed differently, you know, even though it's a palm, might not be as good for something, but good for something else.
Can fiber on the trunks be used?
Yes, it can, and I've seen them used as for making clothes, for also stuffing things, and for insulation in houses. Now, you would not want to completely strip the plant of that. As it gets older, you can kind of pull a little bit off as it ages, but it still needs some of that material on it to protect itself. And that just goes, that's a good general rule for any plant. I mean, one of my favorite books growing up was The Giving Tree, right? And if you've read that book before by Shel Silverstein, you know, it starts out, you know, the little boy uses a little part of the apple tree throughout his life, and at the very end he cuts the tree down, and you know, he sits on the stump as an old man, and it's, you know, kind of that circle of life thing. But you know, after that, it's the end of his life and the apple tree's life. If he hadn't cut it down, maybe his children and grandchildren could have also harvested the apples from it. Or he could have cut off a couple branches and made something else out of it rather than cutting the whole tree down. So kind of thinking about how things can be, how you can maintain the plants so they always provide for you is important. Let's see, how am I doing on time? Because I'm trying to keep my time here. I would also be remiss, I'm here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and in eastern North America, and we are very blessed to have a plethora of pine species. Now, this is Pinus taida, the loblolly pine, very common here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and most people who are from here go, oh, it's just a pine, you know, and write it off and it's done. But pine trees are quite useful. Pretty much every part of this tree can be used for something. I mean, of course, we use the wood for making things, we cut it down for lumber, but we also utilize the bark after it's turned into lumber. That's a lot of our potting soil here in the southeast United States is made from shredded pine bark fines. But then you also have the needles. The needles are really high in vitamin C, so if you need to have that like kind of immune boost, you can steep the needles in tea, and they kind of have it gets really kind of resiny and has that really pine flavor, but it's not going to hurt you. Don't drink a lot of it because it'll hurt your stomach, but it's not going to kill you at all. The pollen, it's gonna be a really heavy pollen season this year. And if you've ever been in Raleigh during the time the pines are releasing their pollen, it's really quite amazing to just see like gusts of wind that are yellow because all the pine trees are just sloughing off their pollen. But the pollen is really high in protein, and you can harvest it and turn it into bread. Bees do that. They make bee bread out of it. The pine cones, they do make seeds that are edible. They're very small, so if you're really hungry, you could go for it. But the pine cones are really good for starting fires. So if you really needed something to start a fire, there you go. So that's start to finish. Every single part of this plant is useful. If you're a horticulturist and you want to utilize all of it, pine trees dry up the soil a lot. So if you're blessed and or cursed with a pine tree in your garden, it's just a microclimate. You can grow something in dry shade. You can really dry out an area and plant something that likes to grow in a dry spot right up against that trunk, and it'll be fine. We like to plant our cyclamen in those spots, and cyclamen love the bases of pine trees. I have 2 more plants that I'd like to talk about because I have talked about shelter and I've talked about a little bit about food and medicine, but I want to talk a little bit about water before we go. So here in the southeastern United States, we are very blessed with a water-rich climate. We do go through droughts, but all in all, we are blessed with a lot of water, generally speaking. And so I think sometimes we take it for granted. I certainly am reminded of it when I travel, how lucky we are to have so much water. But there are places in the world where water is not so plentiful, and plants need water to survive, whether they're growing, in the water or where they get 3 centimeters of rain a year. They still need water to be alive and do what they're doing. And so apunches are a big collection here at Juniper Level. Tony has been collecting apunches for a very long time. And they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. We love our big guys. This is Apuntia lindheimeri, and it's from all over the southwestern United States. And is a large pad type in it, and this one has been very cold tolerant, doesn't have any winter damage on it. And about 3 years ago, we hacked at this thing for 2 days and put a third of it back, and now it is already back to the original size that it was when I put it back in here. But apunchias have kind of evolved into this life form that are really good at conserving water and sugars in their tissues and protecting themselves from the things in the desert regions of the world that would like to get the sugars and the waters. And so whenever you have to survive, you kind of have to think, okay, all plants are made of sugar and water as a basic rule. Which ones have the most sugar and water in them? And how much work are you willing to do to access those sugars and waters within the tissues? A lot of South American or southwestern United States, Central American, Native American tribes eat apuntia as part of their diets, all sorts of different species. They have different techniques for cleaning them off. So apunchias are known to protect themselves with 2 different kinds of leaves, spines and glaucids. This one looks like, oh, this will be really safe to interact with. It's not going to hurt me at all. And actually each one of these little kind of circle dot things on here are covered in what are called glaucids. And if you were to brush up against one of these, 10 to 100 little tiny little needle things would go into whatever you brushed up against it with. And it might seem like you have a rash, but it's actually just tiny needles working their way into your skin. So being able to get those off of the Opuntia is really important, but once you can get that layer of glaucids off, you just have this thing full of sugars and water, and you can beat it down into kind of this pulpy mass. A lot of tribes will stew them into this kind of juicy, soupy mess, and it's actually very good. You can ferment it into a wine. It's very useful and very nutritious. Right next to it, we have an agave, and that's another one of our big collections. And of course, everybody comes here and goes, okay, so where's the tequila, right? Tequila is made out of two different agave species, agave tequiliana and sometimes salmiana, depends on the region. Tequiliana is the big one, though. But what they use as part of either of those species is the center, the piña. And so if you stripped all the leaves of this off, there would be this kind of like fleshy cone thing left in the middle, and that's just the growth bud, and it's full of sugars and water, and they usually stew that down and ferment it to make tequila or mezcal. And you kind of need to do at least some sort of processing to it because it's really bound up in those fibers. But even still, it is still very useful and very nutritious. Agaves are in a family, going back to that taxonomy and knowing how things are related to each other and what they're called. Depends on the taxonomist you ask. Some people put them in their own family, Agaveaceae. Some people put them in the same family as hostas. Hostaceae, which is crazy to me, but if you think about it, it's just a spiky hosta, right? But as a general rule, most people put it into the Asparagaceae family, the asparagus family. And if you've ever seen agave's flower, when the flower bud comes up, it looks like just like a giant asparagus. And the flowers are very similar, and that family, as a general rule, is pretty safe to eat in most cases. Which is one of the reasons why, with a little bit of processing, this one's not going to kill you and give you lots of good sugar and water. So like I said, survival, food, water, shelter. The world is full of plants, and they will provide. Thank you for your time.